Hello and welcome to another exciting episode of What's on Your Shelf. I'm your host, Mulure Mike. Our guest today is none other than Mutendei.
So I'd like to say when it comes to my artwork, I'm mainly a historical fiction writer, but I do a lot of social criticisms within that context. Mutendei is a Bunyore name from my dad's side, so that's what I use when I'm doing my artwork. My dad is from Western Kenya. My mom is Canadian, but she grew up in Argentina. They moved to Canada when they were both studying for university. That's where they met, and then I was one of the end products. And I try to focus on genres that are not usually represented within the content that's available to the audience. The political class has become so detached from the reality Kenyans are facing, and they have their own agenda. If you have the Gen Z population, which as they demonstrate is tribeless, formless, occupying all the MCA positions in 2027, forget about anything else, you'll see a transformation.
Maybe looking at your upbringing, looking at your cultural background, what are some of the things that has inspired who you are today?
You get, growing up in Kenya, you get a broad sense of community, in as much as we were subject to political machinations of tribalism. Once you get to the grassroots and you eliminate the tribal competition, Kenya is a very open community, in as much as we have to resist where the politicians take us. So that's been my focus, is in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but also having boundaries where they respect who you are and you also have to respect who they are.
Yeah.
Yes.
What led to you choosing to settle here?
Okay. First of all, I was born here. I did primary school, did high school, a bit of university here. And I think wherever you, as a human being, come of age, that's where you identify with being your place, right? So even if people from here will travel outside, they'll always see Kenya as home and they'll always have a connection to Kenya. So that's been kind of my reality. Yes.
Primary, secondary, inamaanisha unaozungumza Kiswahili?
Yes.
Zaidi?
Fair enough to get by. I can't say I'm an expert, but I manage.
Now going into your works, you categorize yourself as someone with special, I don't want to say interest, but this is what you work around majorly, historical fiction.
Yes.
What is historical fiction?
So when I try to describe historical fiction, I always reference to what it's not. So I always was recreationally a writer from primary high school, but I didn't take it as seriously as a career until university and after. So this movie called Gods of Egypt, it was done by, I don't know if it was Ridley Scott, I'll have to double check the name behind it, but his idea was that you cannot tell an African story without a white writer, without a white actor. So you had someone who's Scottish and someone who's Norwegian playing Gods of Africa, which doesn't make sense. And that's actually what inspired me to write my first book about African mythology, is tell the story from the roots of where it comes from. And unfortunately with Hollywood and other mainstream agencies, that hasn't been happening. And then when they do tell the story from the roots, it's always obviously poverty, pornography, and all that stuff, right? The poverty mindset, which is not what Africa is about. And so my idea was to, first of all, bring out the widespread content that Africa has, and then put it into a proper canvas. Yes.
How are you able to drive the message home, looking at how sometimes lightly people take fictional conversations?
Yes.
How are you able to ensure that my point is driven home despite being in a fiction format?
Okay. So there's two pillars of thought I use. So first of all, as a writer, I'm writing for myself,
Yeah.
the ideas I want to express. But then I also have to think of how the audience is going to receive it. So whenever I'm developing the book, I always look at what problem is this book going to solve, because a book is a product. So if your book is not solving any problem, then it's not going to sell, it's not going to relate to anyone.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. So when I looked at Shadowwalkers, I was like, I want to make African mythology mainstream and bring out the same level of awareness we have for Roman and Greek legends. So that's the strategy I use.
Yeah.
And then I always tie my message or the discussion I'm having to problems that are existing now or problems existing in the past. Yes.
Yeah. And if you're joining us today, this is what's on your shelf. Today we're hosting Mutendei Nabutete, who has authored 7 books so far. We're going to talk about the books. But Mutendei, take us through your shelf. What's on your shelf?
Okay. So I try to be as diverse as possible with what I read and what I produce. Each of my books has been in a different genre, and I match that with whatever I read. So I do a lot of political reading, I do a lot of fiction reading, sci-fi, fantasy, the works. Yes.
So give me 3 books from this shelf that has been most impactful to you.
I would say 4, but I can give you 3.
4? Okay.
One grew wings and flew away when someone borrowed it. So I have this, the autobiography of Malcolm X, which is basically what I see as a staple for transformation of character. No matter what circumstances you find yourself in, if you resolve in your mind to change and respond to the reality you're facing, you can transform yourself. So that's been a big inspiration, and not accepting the status quo.
Malcolm X is one of the most quoted
Yes.
human beings
Right.
to have lived. How did his works and his life inspire your thought processes?
Okay. In the sense that when we're growing up, being educated in primary and high school, and even beginning of college, you have a safe environment. And I'll use the metaphor of the frog in water, right? People can turn up the heat on you, boil the water, but you're not realizing it until it's too late. And that's been a particular case for the time period Malcolm X existed in. And then he had his awakening by going through the pitfalls of the society that's great for him, ending up in jail as a criminal, abuser of women, that kind of thing. And he turns his life around. Now we're seeing that being played out with the Gen Z revolution today, that we resisted, but even with Black America, we got to a point where we are given some concessions and we became complacent. And I think materialism has a lot to do with that. If you look at Black America, they had the civil rights movement and then they were given concessions, but then it's like materialism took over their minds. And that's the case for not just Black America, but the whole of America. And they are just now, once again, waking up to moving beyond materialism. And that's what Gen Zs have woken up to as well.
What is your quick analysis of where this whole thing has gotten to? With the Gen Zs and the protest and speaking to authority and that kind of a thing?
It's a question of who's working for who, right? Are we putting the cart before the horse, right?
Yeah.
So that's the question where the political class has become so detached from the reality Kenyans are facing, and they have their own agenda. And we are trying now to bring them back to the table and reattach the actual cart that they're supposed to pull. Yes.
When you look at it, where it is today, and the noise seems to be subsiding with each and every dawn, but nothing much is changing, because even the actions that the president had taken, you wanted me to fire the cabinet, I fired the cabinet. You wanted me to do this, I did. But he has rehired the same people again. But from your analysis, from this context, as somebody who is living this reality, what would you say is the next thing? Looking at history, looking at how nations have managed such situations, how populations citizens have managed to navigate such times, and on what would possibly be the next thing?
Okay. I think the framework already exists. We just have to take advantage of it. There was 2 responses I wrote to the Gen Z protests. One was an open letter on Twitter to the president. One was an open letter to the Gen Z protesters, where they've achieved critical mass, but you cannot do the same thing and expect different results. So now they need to pivot. And my idea was, in as much as elections at the top matter, elections at the bottom also matter. So if you have the Gen Z population, which, as they demonstrated, is tribalist, formless, occupying all the MCA positions in 2027, forget about anything else. And they just start doing things at the basic level for the wards where the majority of the youth are. You'll see a transformation. And one of my arguments has been that you've rejected the political class because they don't have merit in what they've done. Some of the politicians are very unqualified in the position. So you have to be the change you want to be. Communists and MCAs achieve 60% of whatever your mandate is, 5 or 10 years, and then you move to pursuing MP or senator or whatever. So gradually you're pushing these people out. Because realistically, you should not go any other industry you go into. You first have to do an internship. You have to go through probationary period. That does not happen in politics. So there's no way that you should be in politics at the lowest rung, which is MCA, unless you've been a community leader for 2 years, 1 or 2 years. Communists and MCA achieve 60%. Really, choose 3 things, do 2 well. You've done a lot, right? Even if you look at Kibaki, he came in, Thika Expressway, devolution, and one other thing that's flows mind, that really transformed the country. Free education. But then the presidents have followed haven't done things in that same mindset that have served the country, right? So Uhuru built his expressway. Being in his shoes, I would have built a subway train all the way from Kangemi to the airport, mass transport. Just imagine if you're charging someone 100 shillings to town, and then 100 shillings from Milolongo coming this way where the SDR is. You have 1 million people passing that way, right? And if it's a government institution, even if you collect half that money, you've solved all your problems of funding, right? So that's the first thing that I've done. So we need to have a graduated political system, comes MCA, MP, senator, governor, then president. So you prove your worth along the way. But then we have people who have not been vetted in the public eye. They appear with the endorsements and they capture the system.
Now, the second one.
Yes. Second one. Yes. So there's 2. One, I'd put Octavia Butler and Mary Shelley. So pioneers both in Afrofantasy. She's actually the pioneer of the Afrofantasy genre. It basically stems from her work. And then Mary Shelley being the mother of science fiction.
Tell us about this one.
So in this book, she's an immortal. They don't really go into the cause of why she becomes immortal, but she's able to shapeshift. So she can transform into animals, birds, and everything. So she's in tune with nature. And she, through different social calamities like slave trade and colonialism, she raises communities of special people to survive that and exist in a protected society. It's a metaphor for protecting youth and the resources from outside and building a strong community. But then she meets another immortal who exists by consuming. So he'll occupy one body and he burns that body up over time. And then he has to jump from body to body. So he can't maintain one form or exist in one space.
But when you reflect on that, I think as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the story of Gor Mahia. I don't know if you interacted with the story of Gor Mahia.
No, I'm familiar with the name, but haven't gone into the story in depth.
Actually, Gor Mahia, the person, had similar powers. And he would transform into... He was a chief Actually, he was a chief, and I've had the privilege of meeting one of the grandsons,
Okay.
who today is quite aged. But they say he had those powers that, as much as we would say, we would call them supernatural,
Yep.
but they say he would transform into something. I remember a conversation I had with one of the grandsons, which I hope one day we will have on What's on Your Shelf. He was telling me that there is a time where people were sent to come and kill him. And then the people who were coming to kill him, he had wind of that same conversation. So as those guys, as he was leaving, I don't know, along the way, he transformed into some old woman.
Okay.
These guys met him and was asking him, "We're looking for such a gentleman," and he told them he's gone that way.
Yes.
And they were speaking to the man. But I feel like with the genre of writing that you've picked, Afrofantasy, which we'll delve into, I think I would want to understand that more. And when you're looking at this thing, some of these traditional African folk tales had that aspect of how do I call it? They almost seemed to be fantasy. But there are people who are very convinced that these were realities of life. But now when you're looking at it, because you've written on it extensively, looking at this and how do you reflect upon the realities of life that come with these fantasies?
So with Wild Seed, my takeaway from it is basically it's a clash of cultures. It's examining a clash of cultures. So you have people from outside with foreign customs who don't know how to exist in one space, which is not colonialist. And then you have people who want to be grounded and protected in their own culture and be able to move freely in all forms, whether it's on land, sea or air, right? And that's now the metaphor for resources and that whole debate. When it comes to now indigenous mythology, it's doing two things. It's communicating social legends and it's entrenching cultural history. So if you look at anywhere that's been colonized, particularly Native America with the native Indians, the languages and everything was wiped out and replaced with foreign culture. And you, in a sense, lose your spirit, your sense of identity. So the good thing about maintaining these stories is you claim that connection to your ancestors, to the land, and whatever, because nothing can exist without narratives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You've mentioned identity, and I think it's something that people talk about a lot, especially when they relate to culture. And there's always been that battle between foreign versus this is not us, this is not who we are.
Right.
But when you hear that word identity, how do you
Okay.
reflect upon it?
So identity essentially is who you are in the individual moment, right? At any one time. The mistake that we're making is, and again, Wild Seed speaks to this, is we are not navigating the trade-off, okay? Because you can embrace external things, but still maintain who you are. It's just that you have to keep your core values and don't let the external things transform your internal core values. Now, if you look at politicians, again, they've internalized foreign things and they've let those foreign things transform their core values. So you can't confirm the current crop of leaders we have to those maybe we had at independence or pre-independence. If you look elsewhere in West Africa, West and Central Africa, which has suffered coups and assassinations, the leaders accepted external things, but did not change their internal values. And that got them to be taken out. So if you look at Congo with Lumumba, and then you had Kabila, who tried to revitalize Lumumba's ideas. That's the question, like how are we managing the trade-off? So we accept all these Greek legends, foreign legends, Avengers, Thor, all that stuff. But then we are letting them take the space of our own legends, which shouldn't happen.
But when you're looking at that African landscape from all sectors, and even beyond the legends, have we negotiated? Because I was part of a certain conversation this past week. A friend of mine who's been on this podcast, France, who was launching a new book. And there was a whole conversation that came during that launch on religion. And there was this debate on, is there one God? Are there several gods? Is there our religion that we had before colonization and this new religion that was imposed on us? But when I look at all those things and I ask myself, do we have an opportunity to negotiate? Do we always negotiate whenever something comes that is foreign, especially from the West?
I think we're guilty of that. Now, it comes into the shattering of the psyche, right? Because my father always tells me some story that when it comes to physicality, people from the western part of Kenya were very physically able. And then they found these foreigners would come with funny sticks, point the sticks, and our warriors would fall from far away. So they'd wonder what kind of magic that is, right? So the warrior psyche was shattered, and particularly in East Africa, we have not been able to restore it. So if you look at Asia, you look at Native America, look at India, the first thing they did was close the borders, dealing specifically with Japan, because they had been decimated by drugs, alcohol, Japan and China both, right? They closed the borders and they found a way to reinstitutionalize the warrior class into society. So you have your samurai. In China, you have your kung fu or Wudan warriors, right? And those are a staple of society. Today, the samurai society still exists. A lot of them have been transformed into a merger of World War II soldiers coming back home and the samurai, which is now where the Yakuza come from. If you look at the same stories, you'd have people come back and they would form the Mau Mau. In America, you had soldiers who went to war come back, and a big part of them became the Black Panthers. But in Kenya, at the grassroots level, we seem to have lost that identity. For example, if you look at Maasais, historically Maasais during these, and I might have the dates wrong, between the 17th and 18th centuries, they are the most feared warrior society within the region. But now when we look at Maasais in the warrior context, and this is not to disparage them, but just stating the reality, they are only available for the welcoming of tourists. We have this movie 300, where we see the Greek Spartan learn how to be a warrior. I have an idea, which I'm actually trying to put in motion with a local scriptwriter, of seeing the story of how a Maasai becomes a Maasai Moran. Like, what rite of passage do you go through? How do you learn to make your weapons? Is there a special skill in making the Maasai spear? Do you have to go and kill an actual lion before you become a Maasai Moran, right? Like, we don't have the warrior journey in Africa. We had it a bit with Shaka Zulu, but then his story has been spun to be more through the European lens, right? So that's one of the things that we need to say. Where is the warrior spirit as a pillar of society in African societies?
And that is one of the biggest things I struggle with. I feel like we have not documented enough of who we are as a people. We have not documented where we are coming from. Because even as we talk about history, and especially looking at the school setup where history is no longer a subject, and even the history that we were studying in class, who had written it?
Correct.
And that informs the tone.
Right.
And I feel like it's high time as an African people, we also went back and documented our own stories, because as much as I feel like sometimes we complain a lot about it, but we've also not taken so much time to document it. But every time we get to that space, we do it in comparison to. We want to do like, we want to do off. But can we just do it for us and say, Mutendei lived. This is what he did. This is how he did it. These were his belief systems. These are the people who were around him, and this is how they related to him, and this is what informed his thought processes, and how can the next generation pick something from that?
Right.
You know, because I feel like there is so much, because if you read about even during that the struggle for freedom and independence, you read about certain people like the guy from Kamba. He was called Kilikitile wa Mwenza or something.
Yes. Yeah.
The guy who was shot at with bullets and he would not die. You read about some of those, the stories of Luanda Magere, the stories, where can our children find them? Where can the next generation, the Gen Alphas and the Gen Zs today, how do they interact with that story? And whose responsibility do you think it is, Mutendei, to document it?
I would say it's everyone's responsibility. It's both the people who are in the art space, the people who are in control of the facilitation, the control of the infrastructure and resources to produce what's needed, and then the audience that consumes. Right. If you look at Korea, Japan, and China, their creative industries are self-sufficient. They don't need anything external. They welcome external because, like I said, we can take things externally but still maintain our local brands, which is why I actually got into cross-media, because the other challenge or misconception artists make is expecting the audience to come to you. You have to go to the audience. So you might write a book that's fantastic, but then the audience doesn't want to consume a book. They don't want to consume a comic, or they don't want to consume a movie. So you need to figure out how to transform that one book into multiple mediums. Now, for example, we have so many celebrated Kenyan authors, from Mejamangi, from Gugu wa Thiong'o, from Margaret Ogola, all these fantastic works. No filmmaker has made these into a movie. But you go to Ghana, you go to Nigeria, go to South Africa, go to America, and you'll find all their main books have been made into movies. And we say we want to produce books and film, but we have all the content here. We don't need to, as you said, copy someone else's stuff outside, right?
Yeah.
So that's another reason why I advocate and do cross-media myself.
Yeah.
As in, we should be producing all these things for the different mediums.
Yeah.
Like if someone wants to do The River and the Source as a movie, the same way that we'll watch these Black American movies about slavery or civil rights struggle, that will be a classic.
I agree. Today, your third and final of your top three.
So final top three. So many. Where is this? Yes. So this one is, again, because Sidney Sheldon, Doomsday Conspiracy, because it combines so many genres. So it's a spy story, a science fiction story, at the same time an investigative story. So he's combined many things that can be enjoyed by a broad audience. Because the other mistake we make is we'll do pigeonhole our tales, will create a story in such a way that it cannot appeal to multiple audiences. Yeah.
But now, when you look at that book, which moment in this book that has stayed with you?
It's the moment when the main character realizes that blindly following and blindly following the instructions of government has been his downfall, right? Because he realizes that he's been used as a tool to be discarded. The Jason Bourne books and movie series also expose the same thing, that we blindly follow this non-organic structure towards its ends, but then we don't realize it's leading us off a cliff. And by the time we get to the cliff, it's too late. So he's able to recognize that before disaster strikes, and then pull himself back and collapse the system.
When you look at these three books, how have they influenced your thought processes or your writing?
Yes, so you can, with Malcolm X, you cannot create a story without a political, social narrative, which comes back to my first point, what problem is your book solving? And then Malcolm X was all about solving the problem of political consciousness. So everything that we write has to have political consciousness in it, right? With the Doomsday Conspiracy, it's not accepting things at face value, right? You always have to be able to reason for yourself in as much as you want to fit into a greater body. And then with Wild Seed, it's how to navigate cultures. Yes.
Right. So I want to transition to Mutendei's books. And as I said earlier, he's an author, a scriptwriter, basically a storyteller. He says he's
cross-media.
Cross-media. He's a cross-media creative. And in case you're joining us right now, this is What's on Your Shelf. And today I'm hosting Mutendei Nabutete, who has done a wide body of works that we are going to explore now. He's done 7 books that we're going to delve into. And also remember that What's on Your Shelf is brought to you in partnership with Nuria Bookstore that also has stocked Mutendei's books. So check them. They're online. They're on nuria.com. But also feel free to visit their physical shop. They are on the first floor of the Bazaar Plaza, right in the Nairobi CBD. Mutendei, now I want to transition to your works. You have 7 books.
Yes, so I have 7, 5 are in print. 3 are currently stocked at Nuria. The other 2 are ebooks. Yes. Sorry.
The thriller story. And all of them you say Mutendei writes.
Yes.
Why Mutendei writes? What was the thought behind how you named yourself on the cover of your books?
So as a creative, you're selling yourself in as much as you're selling your brand. So Mutendei writes kind of became like a brand name, right? To associate my identity as artist. So Mutendei being the personality who now writes.
Tell me something about each, quickly, just a quick summary of each and every of this book.
Sure.
Africanum.
So Africanum is in summary, it's a geopolitical debate, right? And you see what's happening now in West Africa with the Sahel Federation. So a group of sorcerers have been asleep for 6,000 years. They wake up and they find Africa's not the Africa left behind. When they went to sleep, Africa was the global trading empire. And historically, Africa has had communications with China, communications with Eurasia, the Americas, everywhere. There's nowhere that Africa before colonialism hasn't been, but again, that's not really recognized in history. So they wake up and they recruit acolytes to acclimatize themselves to the world, and then they want to restore Africa as the superpower of ancient time, which is what it was, right? Because Greeks would come to learn Africa and study, We had the pyramid builders. We had people who traveled to South America and back. Same thing to China and back. So they recruit an acolyte and they send him to the United Nations with a message saying, as Africanum, which is the Cabal, the collective name for the Cabal, we are no longer going to tolerate exploitation of Africa's resources. We are sending him here as a messenger to communicate that you now have to trade with Africa at fair value. And he's laughed out of the room. So he comes back to them and they go and they recruit or find the descendants of all of Africa's famous warriors, right? So then in Kimathi, they take the blood of his descendants, Shaka Zulu, people from all over, and then they perform a magic spell and they give this one person powers over all of Africa's resources and power over any work that the diaspora has done. So first thing he does with his powers and the other acolytes he's recruited is they go and start reclaiming things in museums that have been stolen and say, okay, we've done this without you knowing. We are giving this as an additional warning. Start trading at fair value. And of course, he's laughed out of the room again. So they start a student uprising, which is mirroring what's happening with Gen Z all over. And there's something called the American African Institution for Alliances, the university alliances that governs or interacts with universities all over the country. So the Secretary of State, his wife is in charge of it. They go and try to find a way to pacify the students through universities, but it doesn't work. So now they send assassins or killer squads to try and hunt these guys down. So Africanum opens up portals over all the colonial centers and just starts pulling resources. So everything that's been made with African resources by African hands, he basically reclaims, collects all the material, the same way Magneto would manipulate metal, and he builds a wall around Africa, drops the wall. So Africa is essentially cut off from the rest of the world. And then the internal governments who have been internal traitors collapse. So these guys now are in charge of everything. Just the way the Sahel Federation is working. And now they try to negotiate, but then launch surprise attacks. So they reclaim land in the Americas and so on. Geopolitical order changes and becomes a discussion. Yeah, from that point.
Yeah.
So just imagining what Africa would look like if it was fully autonomous, in control of its own resources. Yeah.
We'll talk about that.
Thriller story. So this ties into terrorism on the continent and the way our police forces operate, right? So there's the Garissa attack happens, victims happen, disasters happen in Nairobi because of building collapsing. So an old man and a young man come together and they become vigilantes. And then they start taking out quote-unquote leaders. And now the investigative body is tasked to hunting them down and finding out what they're about. And eventually the detectives are swayed to join their side. And then it becomes a question of who's right and who's wrong within the spectrum of organized crime. Yeah.
Wow. Everything.
So this is an anthology of my different poems, just covering political thought, personal experiences, reaction to certain events as well, both within Kenya and externally.
Yeah.
Yes.
So these are poems.
Yes.
Ah, nice. Sundown.
Sundown is also a vigilante story where it's a term of story of disillusionment. So we have a dedicated soldier. He's been in the military, NSIS all his life, police force. And then his sister, who's a bioscientist, comes up with a wonder drug that can cure perennial diseases that occur in slums or in shags in different areas, but the cartels find out. So the cartels kill her and try to frame someone else. So he comes to investigate, and he ends up going down the rabbit hole. And because he finds the sister serum and he takes it, it gives him super strength. And then he has to fight a superpowered mercenary as well, who's been called in by the cartels to try and deal with him and capture the sister's work. Yeah.
The cover is very interesting.
Thanks.
What inspired this the design and
I wanted to get something that would invoke an element of mystery and also relates to the title, The Bad Things Happen at Sundown, under the cover of darkness, right? Yeah. And that's something we need to deal with, like things happening under the cover of darkness.
Shadow Walkers, The Glory of Kings.
Yes. So Shadow Walkers now is my first book, based on African mythology from all over the continent. As I mentioned, it was inspired when I watched Gods of Egypt. I got irritated by the movie, so decided to write an authentic story that fully embraces all the different mythologies we have. So essentially, we have a pantheon of African gods who were precursor to humanity. They spread all over the world.
Yeah.
But then a disagreement happens amongst the gods and they start a civil war. But now they're trying to end the civil war and restore peace among themselves. But this war is happening all over the globe. And then through the war, you learn about the different societies, different kingdoms, different legends of the gods of African cultural heroes within the story.
Yeah. What themes do you say that have surrounded most of your works?
Themes, it can be themes, it can be agenda as well. So telling the untold story and then having our literature serve a purpose. So if you look at the history of literature in Kenya, we had the Pan-African, pre-colonial, post-colonial writers, right? So Meja Mwangi, Gugu wa Thiong'o, Margaret Ogola, and the rest, right? But then there was a gap between them where it's either they didn't, whether intentionally or unintentionally, didn't facilitate the creation of a generation to follow and make space for them. So arts and everything was pushed to the fringe when arts and literature should be the staple center of society, because that's how we learn, how we communicate, how we discuss and immortalize ideas for dissection.
Yeah.
Yes.
You've also worked on comics. Tell us about your comics and maybe these ones?
Yes. So these are an adaptation of the actual mythology book. So I realize Kenyans are very visual. We watch a lot of TV, watch a lot of series, movies, and so on. So I was inspired now to transform the mythology book into a comic and still maintain the same narrative aesthetic, but give it visually, right? And allow for visual representation.
But this is really nice. Who did the illustration? Yourself?
There's a local, very talented artist that I've been working with for a long time, Point Blank Kivumbi.
Yeah.
He did all the illustrations and character design. I even have some of his other comics here as well.
But when you're looking at now, how would you differentiate, or in terms of receptiveness, when you're looking at these books and the comics? How would you compare the reception?
The comics have had a bigger reception.
Yeah.
Because again, the visual nature of the way Kenyans consume, and then the expansion of audiences, right? Because a lot of people would have grown up reading Asterix and Obelix, Tintin, right?
Yeah.
And those are titles that are still existing till now, but then we necessarily didn't have an equivalent. So as soon as you provide an equivalent, people will embrace it.
Yeah.
Yes.
How do you navigate that paradigm of that cultural and historical aspect of your storytelling and the modern aspect of the realities that you face on a day-to-day basis?
Creating in a medium that can be embraced in modern time. For example, Romeo and Juliet. It's been retold in so many ways. Shakespeare's stories have been retold in so many ways as modern adaptations, right?
Yeah.
So we need to focus and champion adapting our stories for different generations. Yeah.
But when you sit back in retrospect, when you look at your works, when you look at the things you've read, when you look at the places you've traveled, how do you view the world today? What are you looking at when you sit back?
The world needs to be an entity with a unity of purpose, right? Now, unfortunately, the institutions that we have and the agendas that are being driven by exploitative powers don't help that along, in as much as they manifest window dressing or false allegiance to things like the Olympics or cooperation, but they really don't internalize that with their actions.
Yeah.
So if you compare NATO or compare the United Nations, to compare something like BRICS, if I was to be an advisor to any African president today, I would say join BRICS. Forget about these other organizations, right? So if you look at the support that the BRICS nations have been given to West Africa, we now have the Niger country producing its own gold, producing its own industries to refine its own resources, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's the gold they have, uranium, and all that stuff. We've had NATO and we've had the United Nations been in existence for 40, 50 years, but they've never taken up that initiative. They've just been pulling things out rather than pulling things in.
Yeah. What social concerns, when you look at all that, do you think need more attention today? What social concerns do you have when you look at this world, when you look at what I would say, where everything is at today?
It becomes the identity and reality of a leader, right?
Yeah.
And then this comes back to what I mentioned earlier about the warrior class. Like, we'll have all these fantastic stories about the ideal American Captain America, or the ideal industrialist Tony Stark and whoever. This Howard Hughes, the guy who did transatlantic flights and all that, right? So they will be held up as iconic people, but they're more so a distraction. If you look at the reality on the ground, for many people in America and the West, it's much different, right?
Yeah.
And then the same thing that we have here, like, we've betrayed our own revolution with the people that we are choosing to iconize and idolize, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But how would you say, how have you addressed them maybe in your works? Because you have a wide range from your books to the comics to films to...
Giving people the lens they should look at in terms of who they view as leaders and what criteria they should use to rate their leaders.
Yeah.
That's, I think, the biggest element of my social narratives, social political narratives.
Yeah. You speak a lot to power, to leadership. But when those words are mentioned, power, leadership, what comes to your mind?
Cause and effect. Like, if you're a leader and you come in with certain promises and you don't manage to fulfill a minimum of 60%, then can you really call yourself a leader, right? Like in Japan and China, they have the honor system where if you are found of guilty of corruption, you have the opportunity to self end yourself, right?
Yeah.
Samurais did it a long time. Like if you're defeated in battle or you fail morally, you end yourself. When people fail themselves and the society morally here, there's no consequence. Yeah.
But in your own view, what role do you feel or think historical fiction has in bringing out these contemporary issues?
It's a mirror for what we've lost, and it's a mirror for what we could be, right? Like technology is not a sign of civilization, right? So we have all this technology, but then we have so many social problems, slums, crime, income inequality, right? But Africa before didn't have all this quote unquote technology. They did have technology, but it wasn't manifested in the same way. They didn't have all these social problems. So is it technology that's a problem, or people who are managing technology and the resources that are the problem? Yeah.
You're also the chair of the Kenya Scriptwriters Guild.
Yes.
Tell us about that, and tell us about what that body seeks to serve.
So Kenya Scriptwriters Guild, we're focusing on writing within the framework of the movie industry as a necessary and technical skill.
Yeah.
So it's a skill that we want to develop across the board, right? And again, be the starting point for cross-media work. If you are creative in any category, your work starts with a story.
Yeah.
And you cannot be a creative without a story. So you should embrace script writing as a central part of your writing creative skill to again be able to tell your story to different audiences. Yes.
Is our storytelling evolving? Are we, when you look at all these things and from that point of leadership,
Yes.
is how do you look at the future of our storytelling?
Okay. It is evolving across the different mediums, but we are either being sidetracked or we are being blind to posterity. Like with a lot of the work that's being created now, it achieves momentary success, but then will not necessarily have value in posterity. So I can today pick any of Major Mwangi's books, give them to any adults, whether Gen Z, Gen X, Millennial, Boomers, whatever generation, and they will find value in the work. But then there are some works being done that outside of their own bubble will not carry forward to future generations, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing that we need to keep in mind. Like, are we creating work that will solve or help us navigate and deal with problems right now, but then also be a frame of reference for future generations? Yes.
You have so much on your plate, Mutendei. You are a man of many talents and very many things. But how do you balance? How do you ensure you remain productive in the midst of all that?
Don't try to do everything yourself, and then be open to collaborating. Another thing that I've noticed is, one, you need to give yourself time to grow. We have a lot of artists who will produce one work and expect that one work to be their be-all, end-all, or achieve overnight success. But if you look at, for example, George R. R. Martin, he's been writing for 15, 20 years. And just within the last 20 years, and just within the last decade, his works came to light and became famous because of the TV series. You have to give, and he still hasn't finished the series, he's still writing it. So you have to give yourself time to grow. Don't be consumed with being an overnight success.
Yeah.
Yes.
Somebody's watching you today, Mutendei,
Yes.
and is an aspiring writer. What are the key ingredients that they need to succeed in that space?
Write a story that you personally know and can personally speak to, or if not necessarily personally know, have a authentic source to base the story on. Yes.
You talk about cross-media storytelling.
Yes.
To somebody who has never interacted with that, maybe you open it up slightly. What is it? What is cross-media storytelling?
Okay. So my own interpretation of it is providing a proof of concept of your work in multiple platforms. One of the biggest challenges when it comes to like comics or filmmaking is the argument that the audience won't buy into the story. There's no audience for that, or no one wants to see that kind of story. So the proof is in the pudding. If you build it, they will come, right? So if we focus on creating good stories and creating them in a cross-media platform, eventually we will draw the audience to us, right? So we've had things like Super Sema, we've had the Kizazi Moto thing, but again, they've taken stories, but not necessarily grassroots stories, but then very, very good African stories, and shown that there's an audience for them. But then we need to be doing that ourselves, because Disney will come, make the story and extract it, Netflix will extract it. Then how much are the local stories and local creatives benefiting?
Yeah.
Yes.
But when you're looking at it, what would you say is the future of cross-media storytelling, maybe in Kenya, beyond?
I think it's collaboration, the different guilds. So we have an actors guild, we have a producers guild, we have a screenwriters guild, we have an authors guild. But then if you ask any one of them, out of the creative history of Kenya from 1963 to now, which has been 60 years, what collaborative project have they done for themselves, right? You have these transactional works that can cut across all fabrics of society, but have not been manifested. So what has been the contribution of each of these groups to the Kenyan society in terms of sustaining it and sustaining its culture? And I think they'll be very hard pressed to tell you what they've done. Right. But then you have an outside body that will come and fund a story like Supermoto, which is a fantastic story. But then we should have been able to do that ourselves. Yes.
If you had to recommend a book to an aspiring writer, aspiring creative, what book would that be? And why?
The book I'd recommend is two books, Striving for the Wind. Well, let's say three. True. So first is Striving for the Wind by Major Mwangi, because it deals with the clash of modernization and rural life. And then there was that social strife where people who would succeed in Nairobi and go back to the rural areas would always seem to have a contemptuous attitude for rural folk. And then that's explored, right? There's still a disconnect between, and they make fun of it on social media, like come December, Slay Queens, Wanarudi Nyumbani, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
The whole thing of being a country boy, of being a city boy, that kind of dynamic. So Major Mwangi Striving for the Wind would be the first one, which I was actually pushing to see if we can get it adapted. There's then the River and the Source. Okay, so that covers feminism in a positive light, like it's feminism without being antagonistic to the male society. And then covering the journey of women folk across social upheavals, whether it's colonialism, tribalism, political awakening, that kind of thing. Then the third would be a book that fits within the same category. Yes, actually, here it is. The Leaves of May. So it very closely mirrors the River and the Source, but now in a more modern context. It's an independent story, but it's very well written. I draw a lot of parallels between the two in terms of the way they achieve their agenda and narrative without being combative.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's very interesting because I'm now interested in... Muthoni Maina is a very young person compared to Mejomonge and Margaret Ogola, who wrote The River and the Source. But now there are there are books in very different generations.
Yes.
What is it that has brought them together in one bucket for you?
So, two things. We have to do away, and Gen Zs are doing away with the thing that we have to wait for leadership or we have to wait for recognition.
Yeah.
We don't have to. You just have to come out and do and create and move your chosen vocation forward. Right?
Yeah.
Don't let anyone tell you that you're qualified or you're capable. Don't necessarily need external validation. Like, yes, you need to know your craft and you need to be good at it, but then get out there and produce and don't worry about reactions. Just keep moving.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Wow. I don't know what you're hearing when you hear this conversation, but where are you watching us from? Kindly feel free to text us. Tell us what part of this conversation has been outstanding for you. What has stood out for you? What has struck a thought in your head listening to this conversation? But now this gives me an opportunity to drop in my trivia question for this week. Now we've given away 2 books already. For a chance to win the 3rd book this week, let me ask you, which one or what is the title of Mutendei's first book that we spoke about? What is the title of Mutendei's first book that we talk about? The first person to comment wins this week's book, courtesy of Noria Bookstore. And remember, this conversation is coming to you on What's on Your Shelves YouTube channel. I don't know if you've subscribed yet. Our channel, when we look at our stats, 60% of the people who are interacting with our content have still not subscribed. Please subscribe to that channel. It allows us to invite onto these seats even bigger guests. Who do you also want to see on What's on Your Shelf? Feel free to reach out to us. Feel free to recommend people that you'd want to see, you'd want to hear from on What's on Your Shelf, and we'll be happy to follow through and look for them. But today, as I conclude,
Yes.
What are you currently working on? What's next? What's coming?
So I am trying to finish post-production of the Shadow Walkers pilot movie. I'm also doing a collaborative book and movie with another author who's very good as well. Sandra Nack. She's written several books. Actually, I have one of her books here, Eastern Butterfly. So she's also a fantasy enthusiast, but she does also a lot of social drama. So we are working on a book and a movie called Zion's Daughter. Yes.
But now when we look at the business side of it,
Yes.
how would you say it has worked for you business-wise, the writing?
It's enough to sustain me and get by, and then build with progressively, right? This also is what informed cross-media, because not everyone necessarily will buy a book, but then people might be more receptive to a comic, or they might be more receptive to the film version, right? So always keep an open mind and be open to expanding your horizons and your audience base. And again, be willing to come to your customer, right?
Yeah.
So that informs cross-media. The other thing is, don't be worried about whatever anyone else is doing, right?
Yeah.
In your artwork, right? And don't feel that any other author is a competitor or is an enemy. Like, I'm in an authors group, and we have very intense, heated debates with other authors. There's Jacob Olliott, who's done his fantastic series on male development. Sandra, there's Dijafu Stories. Like, we've had very antagonistic arguments, but then they're just arguments. The end there, I will still go and support his books, support their works the same way they support mine. If you're secure in yourself and your work is good enough, you'll find your audience. So, for example, if you look at Denzel Washington and Lawrence Fishburne, they are both acclaimed thespians, but they've never butted heads.
Yeah.
If you look at Mariah Carey and Whitney Houston, again, both accomplished artists, they've never butted heads. So you don't need to bat heads or put someone else down to be accomplished.
Yeah.
Yes.
But today I can't close without asking you this question, and it's more social than literature driven, and it's based on your choices, because you born here, you've lived in Canada, came back, and you're currently working here.
Yes.
But there's somebody I would say, I don't know if I would say it's how we've been cultured or it's a thought we've always had that out there is better. What is it that has brought you back? What is it that has made you settle and choose to work here? Yet that opportunity to be out there is also there, and rightfully so.
Okay. Well, a lot of it has to do with my upbringing, having grown up here, been born here, been socialized here, having become
In
an
fact,
adult.
most of us who've been born and raised here are the ones who want to go.
Okay. but again, this comes down to now having a society and political leadership that functions for you, right?
Yeah.
And then we also have to deal with the false advertising, right, of the West, that they celebrate it as this big melting pot, but then their own cities, Flint, Michigan, and I think Detroit have a water problem. You cannot drink the water that's very poisonous, right? They have broken down infrastructure, but then they give you the glamour, but not the reality, right? If you can establish yourself here and become self-sustainable here, then there's no point of going outside, right?
Yeah.
It's good to go outside and see what's out there, but I personally wouldn't recommend it, because then again, it's a question of we suffer now from brain drain, and then the people who could transform the country are being lost. And one of the big things of the Gen Z argument is we don't want jobs outside, we want jobs here, we want to fix here, we want to live, grow up, and die in our country. Why should we look for our salvation elsewhere or our paradise elsewhere when we can find paradise here?
What's your
But
take?
then the politicians, because of the system they've created and the parasitic ecosystems that they exist, they have their paradise here, no one else has it.
Yeah.
Yes.
What's your take? Because there are passports that are ready for anyone who's willing to work abroad.
Right.
And I think the president has made that very clear, that if you're willing to work abroad, your passport will be ready in the fewest days possible.
But why should you be willing to work abroad when we don't have jobs here? It defeats the purpose.
Yeah.
Because the youth are the future of the country. You take away the youth, then you have no future.
Yeah.
And all these people will be shuttling off the mortal coil. Like, for example, the first president, Kenyatta,
Yeah.
Jomo, you can go a whole day without hearing his name.
Yes.
Second president, Moi, you can go a whole day without hearing his name.
Yeah.
Third president, Kibaki, you can go a whole day without hearing his name. Uhuru Kenyatta, fourth president, you can go a whole day without hearing his name and the names of anyone who's been in their administrations.
Yeah.
The same thing will happen with this administration. What legacy are they leaving behind, right?
Yeah.
So there needs to be that sense of humility. Well, what legacy are you leaving behind?
But sometimes I ask myself, because I think you've spoken to leadership a lot, and just maybe getting your take on it. We are in 5-year cycles of election. And for a very long time, the citizenry has been patient enough to say, we are angry, but we will wait.
Yes.
But this time, people refuse to wait.
Right.
It's only 2 years, by the way. When you think about it, this administration has been in leadership for only 2 years.
Yes.
But people seem so tired. What are some of the circumstances? Can it entirely be blamed on this administration, or there are historical injustices that have been happening? They just escalated with this one.
I think it's both, right? Like all these people who are in this administration have been career politicians, right?
Yeah.
What is the purpose of being a career politician? Come, do your 10 years, start as MCA, prove yourself, go to MP, senator, prove yourself, go to governor, prove yourself, and move on. The former governor of Nairobi, Evans Kidero, where is he today? He's nowhere, right? So
Yeah.
that reality will come for everyone. The only thing that's going to sustain you for posterity is what you've achieved. No one will be able to take away the Thika superhighway from Kibaki, right? Devolution is a product of the Orange movement, right?
Yeah.
But those things were there at independence, and then they were suppressed and then brought back, right? Because we had the Majimbo system, but then the cabal that got together wanted to eat everywhere, and it was suppressed. You have to do better than the generation that came before you, right?
Yeah.
And no political class can necessarily say that, especially with this existing government, right? What are their core achievements? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mutendei, for allowing us to interact with your shelf and your reads. But if somebody wants to find, how can they find you? How can they find your works?
Right. So my books are available at Nuria Store. I have 3 in print. So Africanum, Shadow Walkers, and Sundown are in print at Nuria Store. I am working on getting the others into print as well.
Yeah.
All of my books are available as ebooks on Nuria's platform as well.
Okay.
Yes.
And your social platforms, if somebody wants to reach out.
Mutendei Writes on Instagram, X, and yeah.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Mutendei Writes. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining with us to the very end. What part of this conversation has stood out for you? What has been the most outstanding or thought-provoking aspect of this conversation we've had today? Remember, for this week's book, tell us, what was Mutendei's first book that we talked about on this show? For your chance to win a book courtesy of Nuria Bookstore, who are our partners on this podcast. And thank you so much for also keeping me company and experiencing this conversation. I've also enjoyed it equally. And I'll see you again on the next one. I've been your host, Mulure Mike. This is What's on Your Shelf. Bye-bye.